Thanks, Charlotte. And well, first of all, I just want to thank everybody on the team at the festival for organising this. I'm really looking forward to it, and obviously I'm looking forward to Saturday as well with the rest of the events going on. So looking forward to the rest of the week. But as Charlotte said, what I wanted to do today is actually discuss a little bit about the earlier, really early stuff around Grimsby and North East Lincolnshire in general. Without further ado, I'll just give you a quick introduction to broadly what we're going to talk about in the next 25 to 30 minutes, and then there'll be plenty of time for questions at the end as well, which you've probably already seen in your rundown in the email. What I want to do first is introduce the project, which is CITIZAN. I won't try and do the mouthful every time because that'll get dull very quickly. And I want to introduce the Humber based project around that as well, specifically for obvious reasons, because it's based around where we all are. And then I want to go and delve really back in time to a period we call as archaeologists the Paleolithic, which looks at about the last million years in regards to the UK as a whole. But in our region, North East Lincolnshire area, North Lincolnshire in general, it's around about 300 to 400,000 years of human occupation, of humans living in those landscapes. So I wanted to go into that and really show how that connects to all the ever-changing coasts that we've had over that last kind of 500,000 years. So that's what I want to really introduce today, is the changing coastlines in that period. I'll look at a little bit on the lithics. That's the stone tool technologies that we find in these sites. And then what I wanted to finish on, and if I get plenty of time, we'll discuss this in the Q&A as well, is some of the work I've been doing in the last 6 months or so out on Cleethorpes Beach, looking into the prehistory of that area as well, which some of you may have come across in various other guises. But there's some bits of material that we found in the last 6 months that would be really interesting to show you today. So starting with who we are at CITIZAN, and really trying to understand, I guess, the best way to start is to show our mission, to tell you what we're trying to do. And then I'll go into what we've done already in the last 5 years or so as part of the project. First of all, we're trying to raise awareness of the heritage on our coastlines and intertidal zones. And this is England-wide. And we work with people in both Wales, Scotland, and both islands as well, to really tie that in together as a more of a British story. We practice non-intrusive survey, by which I mean we preserve by record. So we preserve everything by recording it as well as best we can and as quickly as we can as it's being eroded or affected by the coastal changes that I'm sure you're all aware of, specifically in our area along the North East Lincolnshire coastline. We practice that by doing regular monitoring, as I just said. So we're trying to get there as often as we can. And we're trying to really engage new communities like yourselves that may not necessarily have looked into some of the bits and pieces of heritage that we look into. So we're a broad-ranging team, which I'll introduce a little bit more in a second. And we look at all different types of archaeological periods and all different types of archaeological kind of practices. So, for example, in Grimsby, we obviously know a lot about the maritime heritage, and really we've been working on that prehistoric heritage over the last couple of years, specifically, which I'll present today. And we're also after new relevant archaeological data to really tell the story of our English coastlines, and we practice high precision surveys. So that's going back to that first point and second point again. So really tying down this material as best as we can as it's being eroded and removed by sea level changes and climate changes that I'll go into a little bit more over the next couple of slides. So really, just to summarise that slide, what we're looking at, and at CITIZAN specifically, is the identification survey and long-term monitoring. And we practice that at the moment in 6 different areas, one of which is the Humber, and I'll show you in a second where the other bases are, so you have a good understanding of where we work. Can't go past this point without really thanking our funders and our project partners. We are actually a project that runs out of the Museum of London Archaeology, so that's the top left one there, but we're also funded by and supported by a number of bodies, most of which you'll probably recognise: Historic England, the National Trust, the Crown Estates, for example, but then a few more different ones, so the Lloyd's Registry Foundation, the Nautical Archaeological Society, and the Council for British Archaeology, which is based in York, where we're based in the northern area. These are our 6 different discovery programs then. So obviously Humberside I've already briefly mentioned, but I'll introduce a bit more. We have one over in Liverpool, Solent Harbours down in the south, and then the East Kent coast and Mersey Island down in the southeast. South Devon Rivers is actually in the process of being written up and wrapped up at the moment. Our phase 2 funding comes to the end in about a year's time. So we're starting to think about new ways of getting more funding and what we want to do going forwards in the next couple of years. The CITIZAN methodology itself then is something a little bit different from what you might see, for example, on something like Time Team. We practice really by training volunteers and getting volunteers to be monitoring our coastline as much and as often as possible. And that's because there's a total of 9 of us in the team. Well, 11 of us including management. And we can't always be on the coastline in specific places constantly. So we're trying to build up volunteer networks that can do that kind of monitoring constantly, and then get hold of us and get in touch with us on a daily basis. We use the volunteers then to monitor the archaeology and find new sites and update old sites, of course, so sites in threat. And then they submit that through our app, which I'll very briefly introduce later, but I will point you towards our website where you can find more information on that. And then that eventually feeds into a number of more research-based databases, such as the Archaeological Data Service, which is also held in York, coincidentally, and the Historic Environment Records. So there's one based in Grimsby, for example, the Northeast Lincolnshire based one, and each county has, or authority has, their own one that people can go to and find out more information about these archaeological and heritage sites. So that's what really we're looking to do, using communities and volunteers to record as much of our archaeological heritage that's under threat by coastal change as we can, as it's increasingly more and more under threat. Just as a quick example, and I'm afraid I don't have a Grimsby based one, but this is actually Hull, an event I did a few years back, some training over 2 days. You can see on the left hand side, it shows you what was there before we started this event, and just as a broad understanding, if I can get my cursor, I'm not sure you can see, but these yellow dots are actually old sites, and these green ones are things that have been recorded by CITIZAN over the last 5 years, or by our volunteers. And you can see what happened within 24 hours, the amount of more increased green dots that grew with just that 1 3 or 4 hour training session, and then letting that group go out and record different material. The Humberside Discovery Programme then has been running for now 2.5 years, close enough, and really looks at this area here. You can just about pick out, it runs from Briglington in the north, so it covers the East Riding coastline, the inner Humber itself, and then we run down to Skegness, and that's the area that we record all of our archaeology in as part of this project. And you can imagine, not only knowing Grimsby yourself, but the area itself is very rich in maritime heritage, 19th century and 18th century maritime heritage, but it's also rich in these Paleolithic landscapes that I briefly mentioned already. Bronze Age forests, which you see at Cleethorpes directly, a really good example of that. But you've also got coastal crust defences from the Second World War, and indeed First World War defences as well. So lots of different periods of heritage that we investigate every day with our different volunteer groups. So as I mentioned, I wanted to start by introducing this Paleolithic period from around about 1 million years ago through to around the end of the last ice age, essentially, so 10,000 years ago. So it's a very, very large period in time. So this will be kind of rushed through just to get to the base of the site that I want to talk about from North Lincolnshire and the area in Northeast Lincolnshire coastline. What this represents here, very simply, is the last 1 million years of the climate record. You can see on the far right-hand side, the high points within all of this represent where sea level was at highest and our climate was at its highest. So you can see a series of these high points, and we call these interglacials, over the past million years, running back right the way to a site called Haysborough, which is on the Norfolk coast. which is our oldest record here in the UK. So by obviously at the opposite end of the scale, you've got the low, what I like to call troughs anyway. So these represent really cool periods in time. So the last glacial period, sorry, 10 to 20,000 years ago, 21,000 years ago, somewhere around there, which we all know is extremely cold. But we've also had a series of these over that last million years as well. And it's important, I guess, from this image just to take away that all of those trough periods there, humans don't get back into Britain. It's too cold. It's far too cold for us to be living during those glacial periods. However, all of these high points, most of them, we do see humans coming into our landscape, and it's that I want to briefly have a look at today. I'll just flick through those. I did explain as I was going. So the enigmatic human species that we can talk about from the last 500,000 years is these guys, the Neanderthals. And they've been reconstructed in various different ways over the last kind of 100 to 150 to 160 years since we've known this species existed prior to the last interglacial period. And you can see just a few of those introductions there. What it's worth highlighting, I guess, and this is on the next slide, is that a lot of our reconstructions that we've done over that last 150 years are now changing because we've got so much more data, so much more archaeology. We can see these individuals and these groups as so much more advanced than we originally reconstructed them as. So as a very brief, again, introduction, they lived in Europe for around about 500,000 years, and they became extinct around about 30,000 years ago in Southern Europe, slightly earlier in Britain itself, and they get replaced by Homo sapiens, so our own species essentially. And there's lots of different ways we can talk about how they interacted with ourselves and our early ancestors, but that's not something I really want to go into today. However, if there are any questions, I'm more than willing to I'll send you over some more material on that area of archaeology. They were shorter and stockier than modern humans, our own species, but they did have larger brain cases on average, which just shows that element of reconstruction that we've been able to pull together over the last 150 years of research, I guess. And they're often now associated directly with symbolic behavior, things like compassion, and increasingly so with the evidence that we're getting from Central Europe, quite advanced uses of healthcare for the time period that we don't necessarily see elsewhere. Looking at Lincolnshire then, let's get back to the archaeology that we want to look at. I'll just flick those open now. So this is more of the whole of the Humberside region, of course. So we've got different sites in different areas, and these all represent sites from that period, from the Paleolithic period itself. And you can see we've got quite a lot if you look down towards interior of southern Lincolnshire. But the coastlines themselves are a little bit sparse in that evidence, and I'll go in a little bit why in a second. This then, streaming in a little bit and zooming in a little bit more to Lincolnshire itself, represents all of those lithics again that I was just discussing, but in a more zoomed in way. And the ones I want to discuss today, less so the northern one there, a place called Keyingham just outside of Hull, but actually this site in Kirmington, which is obviously just over the border into North Lincolnshire, but it's associated with a series of areas further out towards Immingham, essentially, and I'll show you a different map of that in a second. So that's what I wanted to concentrate for the next 10 minutes or so. It's worth just quickly introducing a little bit more about those changes in landscape, massive changes in landscape that have happened over the last 500,000 years. And this includes the coastal landscape. As that sea level has risen and dropped and risen and dropped, that's constantly changed the Lincolnshire coastline, of course. But there's also been massive changes in the river systems within Lincolnshire specifically. Now, these don't necessarily relate to the Humber and the Grimsby area, but what I wanted to pull out is that all of these river systems are gateways, essentially. They're ways of that early humans, Neanderthals, could get into central Britain because they're easier to travel through than, say, going over the wolds, as I'm sure you can imagine. And this just shows quickly that this is the earlier form of the River Trent that actually ran through the middle of Lincoln. So for those of you who know Lincoln as the city, which I'm sure you all do, it was the River Trent that originally ran through there, not through Nottingham, really. So that kind of gives you this idea of these massive landscape changes that have happened over that time period. This then is where I really wanted to get to, because what we want to talk about, of course, is the coastlines and our relationship with the ever-changing coastline. And I hope you can just about pick out this channel here. So what this image is something called a digital elevation model, and it represents the land surface below the sea, obviously offshore, and also inland. So the high areas are the white areas, they're the wolds, as you can imagine. And then the dark black area here specifically is a very deep trench off in the North Sea. Interestingly, this deep trench has probably been caused by that River Trent when it was coming through Lincoln and flushing out lots of material and eroding down into the base. But you can just about pick out this channel here, which is this essentially the Humber coming out past what is now Spurn, before Spurn would have existed. I'll come back to that image in a second, just to relate it back to this site at Kirmington. Kirmington, then, you probably all know the village itself. It's from the gravel extractions just outside of the village. All of these artifacts, 70 artifacts in total, got found within the gravel extraction when they were building places like Grimsby and Hull. They were using all of that gravel and shipping it down into the bigger cities. So what's interesting is it actually sits in what was originally called the Kirmington Fjord, for reasons I'll show you in a second, but it's now referred to really as the Immingham Channel. And this Immingham Channel, I'll actually skip through that one because I want to get to the digital elevation model again. That Immingham Channel exists as a very, very deep underground channel between about Brocklesby here, Brocklesby Station specifically, and right the way out past Immingham. And then obviously I just showed you on the coastal map, it exists into the Humber mouth as well. And I'll show you that again in 2 seconds. What we can see, and what's interesting, and I know this is quite a complicated image, is actually the changing ice banks. So these are all those ice advances when we're in glacial periods. We're pushing through this landscape constantly and changing it constantly. And the one that I want you to pick out is this broadly orange-red line. That's the old coastline there, with a beach sitting at Brocklesby Station, which would have represented a really useful, really resource-rich area for these Neanderthals to be exploiting. Of interest might actually be for anybody around the kind of South Killingholme area to Harborough and those kind of areas. This Immingham Channel actually goes down nearly -50 meters underneath the ground. It's now filled full of lots of other material, mostly from the last ice age, so mostly around about 20,000 years ago. So it's a relatively flat landscape today, once you come off the walls, the front of the walls themselves. But you can see it actually delves down really, really deep, and it's that material that's of interest to us. Going back to the DEM, then you can see just about that channel comes essentially from that Immingham Channel. So that offshore channel is representing an old coastal landscape, because this is a river that would have been running out here. And you can just about pick out that coastal landscape is picking through here. So you can imagine all of that land prior to what we know as Doggerland today, which I'll go into in the last few slides, is actually representing a large open plain off the front of Grimsby and off the front of Cleethorpes and all the way off the Yorkshire coast and Saltfleetby as well. And it's those landscapes that Neanderthals would have been exploiting. When we see the material that's in the Lincoln Valley, for example, they're coming up through the Trent Valley. Those people are coming up through the Trent Valley. The Kirmington material that's here, and on the material that I briefly mentioned over in the East Riding of Yorkshire, those people are travelling up through this channel here and into the Kirmington area, for example, and to what is now we know as the Humber mouth. So just kind of taking that into the idea of trying to explore these landscapes that are offshore, and that's what we're really trying to do. Why Kirmington is actually quite interesting is because lots of the material was totally lost. We didn't know where most of it was, or any of it was for that matter. And I got quite lucky working for Bishop Gostas University in Lincoln and doing some lithic handling work. So showing students the stone tools and what they look like. And I've got a couple of pictures here, in fact, and found this material down in the Lincoln archives. So this material does still exist. It's just been lost in storehouses. And I'm starting to pick together where it all is. As I said, there's 70 artifacts that we know of. I've found about 14 so far. And you can just about pick out these sharper rounded edges. They would have been used for really good cutting tools, essentially for butchery tools and for production of clothing, for production of for working of hide and things like that. So that's what we're really interested in as the lithics themselves. That's just a few other photos. I found these actually in the North Lincolnshire Museum in Scunthorpe. So you can see again a good collection of some other material coming through. And I'm hoping once we're out of all the restrictions, a lot of research institutions are still closed. Once we're out of some more restrictions, I'm hoping to go back and find the rest of those 70 artifacts, and we can look at what this really means for the North East Lincolnshire area in this time period. I'll just skip through that one very quickly just to show you this this curve again. So this is how we are dating this site. So chronostratigraphy essentially means the chronology, how old it is, based on the stratigraphy, which is all the mud, the deposits that are within it. Now, the first orange circle there represents the last glacial period, so around about 21 to 25,000 years ago. So that's the last ice age as we know it. And then you can see the previous warm period to that, remembering that these higher points are the warming periods. That actually we know humans don't get into Britain because the sea level rises far too quickly for everybody to cross across the Dover Strait, essentially. It gets flooded far too quickly. Well, that's our theory anyway. So we don't see humans in that period. So what that tells me is that the Immingham site itself has got to be earlier than that, and that's 125,000 years ago. Now, my belief at the moment, without having been able to date the site using other methods, is that it fits within one of these other high periods here, remembering that all of those lower troughs are too cold for humans to be occupying the UK landscape, even on the south coast. But these high periods are the periods when we see humans occupying. Now, one thing about Kirmington, going back to this slide that I showed you a second ago, is we know that this boulder clay underneath, boulder clay is a glacial deposit. That's so from underneath the glacier, when it's lying on the land surface, it drops out all of this clay and boulders, hence why it's called boulder clay, and that sits underneath. And you'll probably recognize this material because it's the same stuff that underlies most of Cleethorpes as well, and why the cliffs originally were relatively high in certain places in Cleethorpes, but less so towards Grimsby. What's interesting, and going back to our looking at our coastal areas, is that this material infilled next to that boulder clay is actually estuarine. So it's very similar to the material you see in Grimsby and Cleethorpes on the beach, the really deep mud, not the sand, but the muds and the coastal intertidal deposits that we know of from that area. So this means that these people that made those 70 artifacts were essentially living on that beach that I discussed before, which is actually more like Brocklesby Station area than Kirmington. So that's where I wanted to discuss that site specifically. And we do have other evidence for this time period as well. Very similar time. This is well dated to around about 200 to 250,000 years ago, up in the Wolds. So it's not unknown north of that kind of like the Lincoln Gap that we have this material in our record. And it's really trying to pick together how that relates to the offshore landscapes that we see, that we know material has been dredged up from in the past, but without any kind of idea of where it's coming from. Very briefly, then I'm going to flick through to the Cleethorpes material I wanted to see, because I've just noticed, just broadly running out of time. I will go back over some of these slides. They're at the end as well, for joining us in future research episodes if you were so inclined. So Cleethorpes and prehistory then you've probably all come across these beach deposits that sit on the north end of Cleethorpes Beach specifically, although they do go right the way down to the Fitties as well. And they're really, really interesting and really, really good at preserving archaeology. But obviously, as the sea is rising and as these deposits are being affected by different tides and tidal events, then they're being progressively eroded as that's happening. So it's really where we come in to try and record them. Just as an example, here is a trackway that was excavated by colleagues of mine about 4 to 5 years ago now. And this represents a Bronze Age trackway. So it was laid down to make this landscape more accessible. Now, why are they doing that if 2 to 3,000 years ago the sea level was lower, as we've already seen sea level is rising? Well, what we can see here, and I know it's a little bit hard to pick out, but this is the bottom of a large tree. Now, what's happened, the sea level has risen to say where my meter stick is there. It would have killed off that tree. That tree's died and progressively gone. So we know that that time period, sea level was at least at this point. And just, you can't really pick it out because this was an extremely wet, murky day, but that is just about the Cleethorpes shoreline going there, slightly going much towards Grimsby on my right-hand side. So you can see at that point, sea level is at least this point in height above the modern beach, if you like. Now, this is the bit that I wanted to get onto. So this was from a few weeks ago when we were out, about a month ago now. We found another potential trackway. I'll just highlight it with some boxes here. What you've got is you've got the far edge of it compared to where I'm standing, the near edge running here, and you've actually got a little bit of what I think was cut wood just poking out from underneath it. And these would have been large cut woods going this way, and then they would have lain some kind of protection over the top. So again, if you kind of consider that in comparison to when the sea level was rising, killing these trees off, what these people are doing is they're building lots of trackways across this landscape so they can still access it and still use it. And these, of course, now are getting much more eroded as the sea's changing. Those trees themselves obviously have to be earlier than the Bronze Age because they would have had to grow and survive and live. And they represent a time period from the last glacial maximum, from around about 10,000 years ago onwards to around about 6,000 years ago, between the Mesolithic and the Neolithic. And for reference, it would have looked a lot more like this. It certainly wouldn't have looked like a beach. It would have been a dense forest, lots of bracken underneath, and lots of other, again, as I was saying before about resources, lots of resources in there to really use for hunting and for chopping down wood. Of course, they're making those trackways out of something. They would have had to go and find fresh wood, not dead wood, from further inland. And this is quite an interesting example of this happening today over in Sri Lanka. This is actually freshwater reservoir that they've dammed off. But you can see, so at one point, the Cleethorpes landscape would have gone from a dense forest to something like this, to then seeing it more like these trackways being built within the areas that they can build them, so they can access different areas, whether they're accessing it for fish traps potentially, we don't know, we've never found those, but they could be accessing it to still access the foreshore, of course. That's just another example from the Humber further up, and what I've really been hoping, crossed fingers, hoping to find as part of the project. This is a really, really early Bronze Age boat that was found at North Ferriby, so right the way up the Humber. So the landscapes at Cleethorpes would be perfect for preserving this kind of archaeology. Unfortunately, as yet, we haven't found anything like this, but it would be really interesting to find something similar to this, along with those trackways and potentially the fish traps, to really tell us how they're moving through these landscapes as they're progressively changing over time, as that sea level is rising and they're having to adapt on a very quick scale in similar ways to we've been adapting over the last 100 years. And that's just a quick reconstruction, and that's broadly where I'm going to leave us for today. I can go back and quickly show you the slides of joining us, but what I'll do is actually pop our website in the chat box, and then you can peruse that at your own time. There is my email, so if we don't get enough time for the questions, do drop me a line and do check out what we're doing at CITIZAN over the coming weeks. I will just give one plug to one of the events, which is actually going to be the Council for British Archaeology's Festival of Archaeology, the very last day of the archaeological event. We are hoping to run quite a big event in Hull, in the centre of Hull, which obviously will be involved with the CBA with. So if anybody is interested and restrictions are still okay, then please do come and join us in Hull on the 1st of August.